Alright, so for those of you that are wanting to use Aptoids relatively forward, you just go to basically you can do this on your phone, you can do it on a computer, download from here, basically click on download, right? Once you've got your downloads, okay, I'm using BlueStacks. You could do this on your phone, you can do either or. Basically you go over here to where it says APK, okay? I'll show you. Basically you would hit install, so you just go to desktop, you would grab these two and hit open. When you hit open, then they'll install. And then really all you have to do, assuming you've already bound your account on Legend of Mushroom to a Google or a Facebook or some other way, right? If you've already done this on your phone, then it's fairly straightforward. Obviously, you want to bind your account before you do this. But basically, once you do that, then to activate the actual code and get the 5%, all you need to do is go to rewards and go into promo codes. And then all you gotta do is type in Dakanoth LM. Preferably in all caps. And as you can see, it'll do 5%. It is case sensitive, but you can do this on the on your phone. You can do it on PC, either or. And then once you have the Legend of Mushroom app downloaded, again, you can't just go to like the App Store and download it. You have to go to the link to do this, right? Because you're using the Aptoid version of Legend of Mushroom. But then from here, pretty much now, anytime you decide that, okay, I'm going to go buy something, say like $1, for example, you'll notice that this will pop up. And from here, you can basically use your wallet and you can use a credit card or what have you, and basically buy packs, and you can get 5% of your money back. And that's really about all there is to it as far as this is concerned. So that said, okay, so with Lucky Spinner in particular, right now I'd say most everybody ought to be trying to get your Red Soul Selection 2s. If you don't know what that is, it's basically just the, where most people will get acquiring these Red Soul 1s, which you can get just from doing basic acquisition of Soul Trial, right? And going through Soul Prayer, because that's all going to give you Red Selection 1s. You need Red Selection 2s in order to be able to make Fusion. So if you've been wondering how you're supposed to acquire your pink souls, that is how. And there's only like a couple of ways to go about getting Red Soul Selection 2s. And that's either you go in, you can go into like Cross Server, for example. A lot of people will pick up Crimson Moonfall, 100 Slashes, or the Windboard Arrows, and you can get random Red Soul 1s this way, right? Alternatively, you can go and if you're going for Red Soul Selection 2s, for example, right, you've got kind of two directions that you can go in. You can go to cross-server ranked matches, go to the shop, and you can either do one of two things. You can either A, get a Red Soul Selection 2, or B, you can get Awakening Crystals. Arguably, I think you probably will spend most of your time in getting Awakening Crystals, because mostly everybody wants to level their class, but that's another location that you can look for. Okay? Outside of that, alright, the main gist of today's video is also in part of another place that you can go, where basically, so if you've probably noticed, you can go to your family alliance, right? Now this is part of the reason why everyone tells you stay in a good alliance, and preferably one that's a high level one and it's active, right? The reasoning behind this is when you go into Family Brawl, if you go to Exchange, this is where you get Draconic Resonance, Star Array, and Worldly Snare. This is also where you get Red Soul Selection 1s. Notice that I've only told you one place where you can actually get Red Soul Selection 2s, and it also happens to be the cross-server ranked matches. Now, you might have noticed, outside of Family Brawl, right, you've got your Blazing Cave loot, which you'll want to obviously do that every day. Do your Grumpy Big Head, all that stuff, right? That's normal plain Jane stuff. But you'll notice that, like, as far as the shop is concerned, the only place that I know of where Red Soul Selection 2s are acquired is from cross-server rank matches. Now, conveniently, we also happen to know that is your progressive ranking in, like basically as you level stuff up. I mean, I guess another thing that you should know is if you go into the parking wars and you go into the shop, you can, from here, acquire all these different land pieces. You might be thinking, oh, these are purely decorative and they have no value to me whatsoever. That is where you're wrong. All right, because if you go to decoration, you can actually see that, yes, you do get attack bonuses, plus you get bonuses for having certain types of buildings. So if you've been wondering, why am I missing stats? That'd be why, my friends. That'd be another place that you want to make sure you're checking and also doing. This is part of the reason why when people are going into public, they're going to public because, yeah, you're going to get more stuff. Obviously, you got to fight for it, but you might notice cross server spots are going to be a thing here pretty soon. Okay? And that kind of segues into another topic that people have probably heard about, but coming up here pretty soon. I think it's on like the 24th, if my memory serves me right. Basically, we've got a lot of new stuff coming, and I'll go ahead and I'll just real briefly kind of show you what's coming up here. So basically, it's a holy guide build, okay? I like my stun version of this build, and it's not terribly complicated, but we're going to start off by explaining kind of attributes first, and then working into more of the mindset and the logic. We had a lot of different builds in Legend of Mushroom, okay? So each and every one of these advanced attributes, whether it be crit rate, combo, counterstrike, stun, evasion, and regeneration, okay, think of these initial sets like crit rate, combo, and counterstrike. Crit rate fires off pretty much however basic attacks will occasionally proc and make a red possible, that's basically what crit rate is. The likelihood that a basic attack without skills, no nothing, right, is going to then fire off and hit into a crit. And then, of course, you're going to do crit damage. And then there's also something called crit resistance, which is how resistant are you to crits. Basic damage crits, for that matter. And then, of course, you have combo, which is how often do you combo. Counterstrike, how often do you counterstrike after getting hit. And stun being how often do you stun with a basic attack on your opponent. Evasion being, how often do you evade getting hit. And then, of course, regeneration, how much do you heal over time. And then you have ignore stun and ignore evasion. How often do you ignore evasion and ignore stun? Of course, then you have basic attack multiplier, basic attack damage resistance, combo multiplier. So a lot of builds that are like crossbows, archers, and what have you are super high in combo multiplier, and they increase the amount of damage they're doing in combo. Other builds that are like more warrior focused are typically increasing the counter damage ratio and trying to basically increase their HP stat and their counter stat so they do a lot of damage. There's a couple of builds that are running around that are actually basically inflating their basic attack combo, which is kind of interesting because a lot of skills and tools, and by tools, artifacts, and items in the game are going to inflate the amount of damage you do on a single attack off of basic attack. So I've seen some builds running that. Of course, my build in particular, I'm focusing more on skill crit, which is the frequency at which your skills fire off, and the amount of damage that they crit when they fire off. And then the skill damage is a big factor in that, right? So basically, I'm trying to increase the number of times it crits and the number of times that damage is going to be up, when it crits, but also the amount of damage that it does every time it fires off, right? Of course, you have boss damage, which is how much damage you're doing to a boss. Your pals, how much damage your pals are doing. And then healing rate and healing amount are kind of interesting because healing rate is like how frequently you're going to be healing, and the amount of healing amount is kind of related to that, as well as like how much of that is actually being healed. And then you have your HP, attack, and attack speed. Now, a lot of other builds that I've seen that are super big into basic attack are increasing their attack speed. But in general, in a Holy Mage build, for example, like mine, okay, the main thing you have to know is that your skill's cooldown is going to be dependent on the stun. Meaning that if you can stun more frequently, you want to increase that stun stat, but you also want to increase the number of times that your basic attacks fire off. So you've got kind of three things competing here. You have the skill, which is wanting to fire off as frequently as possible. That's why people will tell you you need skill crit and you need stun, because basically what your build is designed to do in this class particularly is the idea is that by firing it off more frequently, you're going to do better. All right. Now, how you go about achieving that varies depending on what people do. Like in my case, I am going, basically Demon Mask, Thundercaller Kite, Flame Book for PvP if I'm not doing that. Otherwise, if I'm not, I'm going to probably do Beast Type Book for the damage on bosses. Then you can do Crimson Sickle, for example, if you're doing Blade Pierce or Wild Gust, or you can just as easily go to like Storm Necklace if you've got Clone Strike. The Abyss Necklace is helpful if people have Moonfall. But again, not a lot of people do. Next piece would be Blitz Assault, because you'll get damage immunity with that. And I'll kind of explain that later. A lot of builds run on Time Statue in the Holy Guide builds, because you're extending the amount of time that your opponent is stunned and or disarmed, or, in the case of Smoke Bomb, the amount of length of time that they're going to be vulnerable. All right. The alternative, and you might be wondering why I use Stellar Statue, is Star Array and 100 Slashes and Worldly Snare. Worldly Snare increases the likelihood that your basic attack crit damage is going to occur. Star Array increases the skill crit rate at which your skills occur, fire off in crits. And 100 Slashes is kind of unique in that what 100 Slashes does, and you'll notice that I actually have it in this build, and this is part of the reason why I like it so much, is that what it does is it basically does a 20% basic attack damage resistance and then gives you half of your attack of your current HP for 5 seconds, which is huge. Because if your HP stat in like a warrior build, for example, is really big and you have a ton of health, well, then you're going to get half of your health as an attack stat for 5 seconds. And if you extend that duration by another 50%, you're basically getting like a stupid amount of time where that stat is true. But it's also true of Star Array as well, which is to say that not only am I going to be more resistant to basic attack damage, which a lot of builds in general are running, right? But then you've also got Star Array. In the case of Star Array, what's unique about this is that this is increasing the length of time that skill damage crit rate can continuously go, which means it scales the amount of skill crit that I've already got, which is at 50%, and just makes it that much stronger because you're getting 3% skill crit on top of that. So it's already kind of nutty to have 50% skill crit rate, and then when Star Array fires, it's at 60% plus 1% for every second that it's going, plus you get the 3% in skill crit damage. Okay? Now you might be thinking, okay, then why have Clone Strike in this build? It's the same reason why you have Shroom Shield. The idea is to basically, you want to be able to live longer so you can have another clone take all that damage for you. The Shroom Shield can fire off, and you can use, basically, for those of you that aren't familiar with this, you basically, if you want to make a skill delay, all you gotta do is go up to here, and then go to the set in question, and then here you can adjust the delays. And you might notice I have skill 3 set to a 1.5 second delay. That is to say, I'll pop a 10-second shield, but then 1.5 seconds later I'll pop a clone. The only reason why is because every once in a while somebody can pop through a shield, because it's only 20% of your max HP. So if you have another clone fit for whatever amount of massive damage they do on that shield, that clone's going to give you just that much more time to survive. That's why I don't wait the full 10 seconds. It just didn't work out, at least in practice. And it's not to say you couldn't just do it with 0 delay and maybe you'll have similar results, but the idea was that most skills usually end in 1.5 seconds after doing all their damage, so thus it seemed like a logical way to go about doing that. Outside of that, I want the other skills to fire off as much as they can. And part of the reason why I, in a build like a Holy Guide build, for example, right, the big emphasis that I have in my build right now is actually Dazzled. You might be thinking, well, why not have like a combination, say like, for example, Disarm and smoke bomb, and then just go time statue and run that route. And that works great, don't get me wrong. You can run that route and then throw in Blitz Assault or Wild Gust or Blade Pierce, and it works fantastic. That will absolutely do phenomenal against most opponents. But then you might be thinking, well, what could you do differently? And in my build, I know that every time I stun, then my CDs are basically going to lower. And because these skills here increase the amount of damage and the frequency at which they fire off in a crit, I was like, okay, let's just play with that a little more. Let's basically cause a stun to occur more and more and more. And thus you get, the major benefit that comes with it. In fact, I was kind of thinking Meteor Fall might be interesting because you're going to add 30% skill damage. It's just there's not enough DPS coming off of Meteor Fall to justify using it when you have immortal skills. Like, it actually makes more sense to use Blade Pierce at that rate. But needless to say, right? I will eventually play with Crimson Moonfall when I acquire it and kind of see what I think of that. I don't know if it's really much better than what you could get with 100 Slashes, in part because I feel like getting half of your health, based on current health, I should say, I think that could be more advantageous in the long term, where this is just doing a flat 50 increase of your damage stack up to 3 times. Maybe. But that said, one of the things that you want to pay very close attention to in this build that I've got is, now you might be thinking, okay, what do you actually have in the build itself? I'm focusing on skill crit and a lot of the gear pieces. My emphasis on skill crit isn't really being done like at a necessity. If anything, I run Aurus gear. And when you're starting out and you're wanting to get this build really kind of fruited to its full potential, you really want to get an Aurus set of gear first, because you'll get the core stats coming off of your level from your gear. But eventually, I think focusing on getting stuns is probably more beneficial in the long run. And then focusing on skill crit is kind of an after-fact thought, right? At least in this build. Now, as far as artifact choices go, of course, I ran Elemental Wrath, which is giving 10% global skill damage, and then I'm running a global basic attack increase with Mana Mastery. I would like to try and modify this so that I was actually modifying a stat that might have improved anything from skill crit damage to stun, but yeah, it takes a lot of playing around with this that, it's like it'll take forever. Now, of course, like any of the other pieces, Eye of the Raven would be really nice in a build like this, just because you're going to pop it another random active skill every 20 seconds. But even that, it's like looking at like things like Springcord, where you can pop 1,000% of your current basic AoE damage off of basic attack. You can kind of start to see a trend here. A lot of these skills run off of basic attack damage, and they're kind of designed in such a way that that's where a lot of your DPS is going to come through. But what's interesting about Tear Attack is the fact that it uses 20% of a character's max HP, and when it dies, it explodes and deals 1,000% basic attack damage. So it's stupid crazy good if you're running a really heavy basic attack, anything doing basic damage. You could basically murder the heck out of somebody doing it that way. But as far as like the actual souls in particular, if I could get anything in this build, I'm pretty sure I would like to grab as many wildlife piercers and Eye of the Abysses that I could possible. In part because whenever and if I had to choose, Eye of the Abyss would be a huge one, because that's going to increase your crits, and you really need crit damage in order to make this build really work as well as it does. If you can improve stun and crit, I think these are the two things that you really want to focus on. More or less, as far as pals are concerned, of course, you want the Treasure Dragon, or pretty much a dragon that is increasing your skill crit rate. And then you want a Hydra Sprite for that skill energy regen. Then you can get Fiery Tail for a base increase to your skill damage. And the Alpine Fox is pretty much a given. Like, you need the Alpine Fox for the duration increase for your stuns and the damage done to stunned enemies. And then you want Cat Prints, mainly because as you're using active skills, you're going to get 200% damage done to them after the fact, right? I will say that if there's anything I would play around with, and it might be tweaked a lot more, is going to be really highly dependent on, like, so like, for example, if you ran combo builds, you'd love Righteous Banana. You would absolutely adore having Pirate Octopus, right? But you might notice like Electric Pup is kind of interesting because you get 1% of lost HP on a counter. There's like Wealthy Lizard, which increases your PAL damage by 40%. There's like different little pals in here that are pretty valuable for different types of builds. Like a Hero Bird, for example, is going to increase your attack speed. Your Chicken Hood is going to increase your basic attack damage. Like, that's part of the reasoning behind why a lot of people will run builds that have these. It's like that's part of the mindset of why you throw them in there. And I only point this out because I feel like a lot of people will just tell you to use this, but not really give you a reason as to why. And that's, I mean, kind of the mindset of why they're picking what they're picking is once you have this knowledge, it all clicks. Now, that said, I don't know, running at 25k right now, I'm not super heavy into any one thing. As far as the back accessory goes, I'm running this side of the tree for the Sork because I think if you can get Endless Outburst, this will turn this build into a absolute monster. Because basically you can fire off skill crit 60 to 70% of the time, and it's going to just go in cycles as quick as it possibly can. If you can combine that with an increased stun duration and the frequency at which stuns fire off, then your skill CD goes slower. Basically, you're increasing the skill crit, you're increasing the frequency at which the cooldown for said skill fires off, and you're simultaneously running like a bunch of DPS because of that. Like, that's the long term. That's what we're ultimately aiming to achieve here. Now, I'm using the Myriad Spikes, which, again, this is AoE bleed damage, which is kind of interesting. It does 200% of your basic attack 5 times, ignores damage immunity, and has a 50% chance of dealing extra damage up to 1.5% of max HP, which is pretty cool. The Peppy Style Thruster is also a pretty interesting one to throw in the mix. I've used that in boss builds, but it's not as handy if you're going against players. If there's any piece that I want probably more than anything right now, at least on this side of it, okay, is the Moonlight Wisp is going to give you an increase to skill damage by 1.5% up to 10 times, which means you can get up to 15% there. For like combo builds, that's the Emerald Embrace. For the Blade Pursuit, that's your counter builds. So depending on what you're aiming for, you can get basically 15% out of your back accessories. But like things like the Lustrous Plumage, for example, will give you 10% attack boost, but it'll give you 40 times a 0.5% defense increase, which kind of handy. But I think the Myriad Spikes is so far one of the better Celestial Surprise, basically that being one of my favorites so far, even though it only fires off every 11 seconds. Assuming you live that long. But outside of that, right, now you might notice I've got Round Peppy, which, again, this is handy because it's going to pop a stun for an additional 1 second. This is helpful, anything that can fire off a stun is huge. Now you might be thinking Firebreaker, that's crit rate, which goes back to basic, basic attacks. That's helpful. Attack speed's not terribly helpful. Light type, it's okay. Like you can get some value out of that. The Blue Ox is big for control effects. Purple Wing deals 5,000 AoE damage. Not terribly handy in this build. Of course, this deals up to 10% damage dealt up to 5 surrounding enemies when dealing damage. The Cloud Drifter is going to be the hugest one for a skill crit build. So you're going to get a skill crit rate increase by 10%, and after a skill critical, you can boost your attack by 20% for 5 seconds. And like I was saying earlier, when you have a skill crit rate of 60% and you pop it off every time, that makes the Cloud Drifter one of the best, if not the best, I think, for this build. But you can also see how Magic Carpet could be handy, because you're going to cast skills 6 times and restore full energy to 1 random skill. Could be pretty interesting depending on what that skill ends up being, but it's a random run-of-the-draw type deal. So between Magic Carpet and Cloud Drifter, I can kind of see how either build could be pretty darn handy. That said, as far as the overall build is concerned, and as far as doing cross server showdown, one thing I will say is that if you haven't already, make sure you're going in and basically you just want to go to your own kingdom, defend your own kingdom if you can, because again, it's free entry to go in there. So if you see somebody that's going around challenging, which based on this, somebody is clearly challenging, we just got to go find them though. All we have to do. Sometimes you're not that lucky. Sometimes they get murdered right away. One thing I can say is that you can hit monsters in your own kingdom, so you don't necessarily have to be like fighting players. And you'll get loot for this up to like a certain number of times, and then that's really all there is to it. But like here, okay, so just naturally turn off auto. Of course, now we gotta wait. Fudge. Well, we know they're in Candy Paradise somewhere. Just don't know where. Oh, they're there. And no. Okay. Maybe. Okay. Let's see how this plays out. So this is how the build currently runs. And so far, I've never really had too much trouble with it. Like, it works pretty good. Like, I can mollywop players that are like 2,000 to 3,000 higher than me, usually, without a whole lot of trouble. And so, like, this guy, yeah, he's gone. So that's pretty much that, though, as far as the build's concerned. Of course, I can kind of show you how it plays out if... I don't know. Can we? No, I can't. All right. I was gonna say I would show you. We'll go ahead and do some Chrono Tower and such. But this is pretty much how this build runs. And it's not bad, like it's, even for mild free-to-play or somebody that's, and by mild I'm saying like you're, logging every day, you're doing everything. If this is the type of build you want to run, the biggest issue I've seen with skill crit builds compared to like your combo builds and your counter builds is that you have to invest pretty heavily into it in terms of getting what you can out of basically proccing stuns. There's not very many skills in the game that'll actually fire off stuns, and so thus you are kind of dependent on trying to fire off a higher attack speed, and that's okay. Like, you can run basic attack builds, increase your attack speed, and basically run off of combo as a way to basically manage that, right? But I've also kind of figured, you could probably just as easily see people build like a warrior, for example, that all he does is have a stupid amount of HP and a stupid amount of counter. And then every time he gets countered, boom, he just flattens. Because he can just, just basically blast at full blast at somebody every time he gets hit. Like, that could arguably work really well to your favor. The bigger reason why we use Shroom Shield here is this is ultimately what keeps us alive almost indefinitely. I've seen a lot of builds that, they like to throw in, like, disarm, and then they'll throw in, like... And that's okay if your shield, you're having a hard time basically stalling them. But even in this build, by having Clone Strike in place of that, it usually works fairly okay. The only downside is you have that 4 to 5 second delay there, where you don't have a whole lot of control over how it's going to play out. And it's during this, you can kind of see what I mean. Like, your basic attack and combo are kind of what kind of carry you during those mid transitions, and the higher your basic attack is, the better that is going to be for you. The downside to that, though, is that what you're sacrificing in basic attack, you could have maybe had in skill damage or skill crit, or even in stun that, maybe can be used elsewhere. And so that's kind of one of the things that I find myself fighting over. Like in my prayer statue right now, I'm working on a set 3, and I'm basically 2 global attack, the rest skill damage is ultimately the goal here. Trying to get all triple S skill damage, so that way we get the most amount of skill damage we can possible. But even, in like this set, this is what I was using to start out, and this works fairly well. I am kind of exploring, like, what it would look like if I did nothing but skill damage, or what if I played with, even crit damage in a focused build, for example. Of course, the big thing is, if you're not already doing this, you want to be mining and trying to get your tech park as far down as possible. I've already got my tech tree pretty much, for the most part, already built all the way through. Of course, parking wars wise, just going around and doing the. I usually pick anything after 3 hours. You don't want to hold on to these any longer than 3 hours, generally speaking, especially if you're on public parks. As far as dormitory is concerned, this is a pretty good place to go around and retain and just acquire players. You can get a lot of loot this way. So if you're not already doing dormitory, then you kind of need to be. As far as affinity goes, I've been I'm cheesing the cordial. I'm just sending gifts to people so I can get the cordial, affinity, and I'm cheesing that for the loot. Now, of course, you can form bonds, right? Like if you wanted to, you could form a bond with somebody and say, "Hey, you want to form a bond?" Form a bond with them. You can also, basically as you acquire bonds, then you can get basically a wedding set up and do all that fun stuff, and then you can actually start working on your ring. But naturally, like one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing in this game in particular is I'm actually running a lot of farming. And part of that's because of the statue being where you can get a large chunk of those stats at. I mean, one of the things that sucks is that you don't really have a lot of control over what drops in the prayer statue. But like right now, because it's such a heavy investment into prayer rush, you can get a lot of stuff out of here, so you might as well go ahead and go through it. Just don't buy the rush rewards, because I think that's silly. Like, if you've been doing what I've been doing, literally all you do is go into Shroomy Farm, and then you buy your fertilizer up to 5 times. No more than 5 times. Anything past 5, it's stupid, in my opinion. But then, basically run your fertilizers on your advanced seeds to get the best possible loot, rinse, repeat, and then eventually I will get Cloud Drifter. I'm hoping. It's going to take a while. I've only got 5. I need another 15 before I can even find myself there. And the only way you can really achieve that is by saving in Legend of Mushroom. That's really about all you can do. But other than that, if there's anything else that I would love to point out, I guess you guys have probably picked up with Legendary Tycoon. The basic gist of Tycoon is that you're gonna grab a lot of these coins, and about all I would suggest you do, as far as the coins are concerned, is you'll hit the shop here, and in here you can buy a lot of different items. I'm of the opinion the hammers are one of the best, but you could just as easily buy, like, the gears would be a big deal, getting the seeds would be a big deal, or even getting the scrolls. I mean, those are all very good options. The only thing in here that I see of any value is, I think, the clockwinders. I mean, yeah, you can go down this route if you're wanting to tech rush later down the road. You could also do fertilizer if you want to do prayer rush. Entirely up to you. Of course, you can buy the 2 times, and then you can buy all of these. But what I did is I just bought all of the clockwinders, is what I did. And that ultimately worked out really well for me. And then what I've done is bought up the empowerment gears, the hammers, and the clockwinders, and that's really kind of what I focused on. And then I grabbed the premium seeds and then the skill of pal draw tickets. And now I'm just picking up speed up coupons now as kind of a extra added benefit, right? But that's the basic gist of Legendary Tycoon as far as I'm concerned. But as far as this build is concerned, how well does it actually play out against players in PvP? I mean, like I was explaining to you earlier, I've never really had a problem. Like, if I go into Arena, let's say we pick somebody that is around my level, right? This guy's 25k. And you can kind of see how this build plays out. So you can see I'm taking a lot of damage. This guy's got a lot of focused damage coming in. But it really doesn't start to flaw as bad. As you can kind of see, we still ended up winning. It looks like we lost, but we ended up winning. Which is kind of funny, right? But like here you got this guy is 26k. Looks better in every way possible. But yet, yeah, I mean, the problem with the 20% Shroom Shield here is you do enough damage before it fires off, then you're only going to get whatever you can possible out of it, and it's wasted. So if you don't want to play stupid, don't pop a Shroom Shield too late. A lot of people just, I don't know, they don't do it right. Like in this build, you can see I like to stun. I wish I could stun more, and that's one of the things that's actually kind of affecting this build more than anything, is the fact that I don't have enough stun right now, like I did before. And that only difference, really, that for that reason, like the reason why this build's not doing as well as it was because I dropped a lot of the stun that I had in my gear in favor of Aurus gear, which I did. You can't be picky when you're starting with Aurus gear, because you just don't have the luxury of getting picky yet. You know, once I finally get enough lamps, I can start getting picky, but I've got a long ways to go. But when I do, what I'll do is basically you go Aurus and above, and then you want to filter on stun. And then you don't want to worry about, you know, having both at the same. Just do stuns and fire this thing off. And just wait until you get your stun. And that's what you're wanting to grab. The problem being is obviously the odds that you're going to run into Aurus and stun at the same time. You're just kind of shooting bullets. You'll actually waste Aurus gear doing this. And thus, I don't advise doing that. Like, focus on getting Aurus gear, then focus on narrowing it down and actually getting the stats that you're after. Because their core stats coming off of Aurus gear is better than the alternative. And I mean, sure, some builds are probably going to be a little bit more lenient than I am, you know, as far as the percentages are concerned. But in my experience, that's kind of where I'm at with that. So I'm only down to one final piece. I don't know if we'll actually acquire it. You might be noticing I'm only doing one at a time. Yeah, that's another newbie mistake a lot of people make. You can, in fact, adjust the number of lamps that you use, and then you can just, you know, fire it off like that. And then instead of doing 1, you're doing 10 every time. A lot easier. But outside of that, I mean, really, I would say, if anything, of course, running spins. Of course, I guess for any of you that are new to the game, use my invite code, enter the code, and, you know, help me help you. And needless to say, make sure you're checking out Aptoid if that's something that interests you, because you can easily save a stupid amount of money playing Legend of Mushroom playing this way, especially compared to like the people that are doing it on Google Play, because you, or even Apple Pay, like you're getting completely screwed. You're wondering why there's so many whales that are ahead of everybody, and the reasoning for that is because really of things like Aptoid that make it possible for you to really save a lot for your money's worth that you're spending in the game anyway. It's just silly to do anything otherwise. But outside of that, I would say, well, that is pretty much it for today's video. This is the build that I've got running. I mean, I would say if there's anything I'm going to tweak, and if it isn't already obvious, is I need to increase the amount of times that my stun fires off, and the frequency can be adjusted by increasing attack speed. So I may end up having to swap one of these pals, and or I may be looking at different ways to increase the attack speed. I'm willing to give up cat prints just on the off chance that I can, you know, fire off a few more times. And if that means swapping to bird, then so be it. I mean, it's that, or I could, you know, just as easily for what I get in skill damage, I could sacrifice the 60% I'm getting out of Fiery Tail. But the biggest drawback to any of those decisions, like even like Treasure Dragon being where you can increase your skill crit rate by 20%, is you've lost something, you know, and so you've got to kind of find a happy medium between all of these. Like I could just as easily, you know, the number of times that I've had stuns occur, right? I could just as easily like say, okay, instead of having this, get the bird, get the attack speed, and be on my merry way. But I don't know. Right now, this is the happy spot. But until we can get to a place where you know, our attack speed fires off more frequently, then there's no reason to adjust. And that's part of the reason why when I look at like other people's builds, so like for example, there's Stewie. Stewie's a pretty cool player. He runs as a Plume Monarch in this game. If you look at his build, what he's done is he's gone super heavy into crit damage, basic attack damage. His combos are kind of questionable here and there. And you can see his, you know, basically, I don't need that. Yeah, because again, this is all my stats. But you look at what he's got going, and it's like, okay, so he's got higher basic attack, higher crit damage, and he has a stupid high combo multiplier of 14,000. And then you look at that, and it's like, oh, okay. So when he combos, he's going absolutely mayhem crazy on his combos, right? And you can also see his attack speed goes up by 50%. Now, if you look at the actual part of where this is coming from, it's also partly in part because of class, also coming out of tech, also coming from his partner, which you might be thinking, where's that coming from? That's the POW, right? So there's 15% coming off the POW for the bird, 15% for the class, and then a current attack speed bonus total is kind of an interesting one, but basically that's what's giving him that 50% attack speed increase. Now, if we actually look at his core final attack speed being 4.18, being part of it being class, and also part, just by looking at like, from this, you can kind of see how that's come to fruition. Like if we wanted to do something comparable, we could. Of course, he's got got his little marriage binding thing. He's got the other bonuses and stuff, and he's only at 40k compared to like my 25k. But this kind of gives you an idea of like, part of the other thing too is that if you look at his attack bonus, right, his skills are at 12k, partner or pals are 20k, relics are 28k, mounts are 54k. A lot just in mounts. Artifacts is 50k. And one thing you've noticed is nobody ever has any souls directly in their stat sets. I'm one of the few that have a really high level attack soul, so I always find myself going, oh, that must be something different. Parking slot, back accessory, the ring here. You can see his ring's at 1700. His global attack's 150. He's getting 0 out of his class, but his mount is giving him 12. Statue he's getting 0 on, but he's getting 34 from an artifact, 75 coming off of souls, and then 28 off the awakened seal, and 2% coming off of a costume. So, I mean, you can kind of see how this is all playing out. But as you can see, even in his build, he's not worried about skill damage. He's not worried about any of that. If you wonder where is he getting that 14k number from, it's all coming out of souls. That's where a large chunk of that combo damage is coming from. Of course, he's got 140 coming off his class, 100 for his pals. He's got 600 coming off the handbook, 130 off the mount. He's got 82 coming off of his Awakened Seal. He's got 540 coming off of Enchantment. And then his back accessory is giving him 150. He's getting 360 off his statue and 29% off his enchants. And this is part of the reason why like a lot of combo builds are running really stupid high stats. Now, like Captain, for example, you might start to see kind of a similar trend here. A lot of people love going combo. There's a stupid amount of that. You don't see too many players that are not combo focused if they're at the top of the rankings. So like if we look at Pep here runs, let's see, what is he running? Yeah, another combo build, stupid high combo. And again, you might be thinking, are they the same class? Yeah, that's a Plume Monarch, and that's a Sacred Hunter. If we look at Ruse, another Plume Monarch. And again, kind of the same idea. He's just running a really high combo multiplier. Which, it basically equates to a stupid amount of damage. Because the more combos you fire off, the more DPS you're going to do. If we look at, say, Blit, for example, he's a Plume Monarch. Let's see, Jumbo, Sacred Hunter. Captain Morgan's a Plume Monarch. You can kind of see there's a lot of Plume Monarchs. Leonard's is a Warbringer, which is kind of interesting. And if you look at his build, you can see he's got basic attack, crit damage. He's got 7,000 or so in his counter. So he's one of the few players that isn't running really a heavy combo multiplier, but a really high counter multiplier. And so that really translates well into his build. I'm going to probably be one of the few people that have a stupid high skill crit damage build, but we'll see if it actually plays out well enough against these combo builds. Because a lot of these combo builds seem to be on fire right now, at least in my arena. I don't know how well it'll actually play out in other people's states, since I'm not that well educated on how well that will play out in the long term. But needless to say, That's pretty much that. Hope you guys found this helpful, and see you guys next time.